The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Dan Cooper on the devastating impact of a criminal justice system that targets poor neighborhoods. Leo Gerard, president of the United Steelworkers International Union, on the stock buyback bonanza fueled by the GOP tax plan. Plus, Bill Press with Mike Lux, author of How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Dan Cooper is a scholar and activist who fights for more equitable cities. He says policies designed to keep our cities safe are only deepening the cycle of violence and poverty. And we say hello to Dan Cooper, Executive Director of the Center for Equitable Cities at Adler University in Chicago, and co-author with Ryan Lugalia Holland of The War on Neighborhoods, Policing, Prison, and Punishment in a Divided City. Dan Cooper, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
And certainly our pleasure to have you with us. You know, much of the book comes from your experience working in Austin, which is a neighborhood in West Chicago. And you use the term concentrated punishment. What happens in Austin that doesn't happen in the other parts of town?
That's a great question. So we sort of define concentrated punishment as long-term disinvestment and long-term misinvestment. So it's a combination that doesn't happen in white neighborhoods. It's only something that draws back to the historical legacy of racist and exclusionary housing policies from the 50s that segregated African-American neighborhoods. Then once you had the creation of these neighborhoods, we've done very little by way of positive investments and have been very heavy on policing and investments in removing people through incarceration.
How did you come to understand the reasons behind such high incarceration rates?
So, I mean, that's a great question. Part of it is, being a researcher, Ryan and I just studied the city and how it was made over time, but also part of it was working there. So I was in Austin, the west side of Chicago, during the foreclosure crisis, and my interest was primarily housing, just seeing what an impact it was having on neighborhoods and thinking about what sort of policy solutions and program solutions we could implement that would help this. But more and more, both Ryan and I kept coming to the conclusion that all the people living in this neighborhood had a lot of contact with the justice system, so it wasn't as simple as just providing housing. So just by coming into contact with people and understanding what an impact having a record has had on the families of these folks, of their employability, of the prospects of saving enough money for a home, little by little we came to see that the justice system had a huge impact on a number of people's lives and not just the people who had been in prison.
Mm-hmm. And besides the impact on an individual life, which I think is pretty apparent, what's the broader impact on a neighborhood?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's something that gets ignored because we tend to think about crime rates instead, and we think very short term. We think, oh, crime is up this year. What can we do about it? We need more policing there. But we make the argument that crime rates can actually be understood through historical patterns of incarceration. So as we started to become addicted to punishment and mass incarceration began to take off under the Reagan administration in the early 1980s, we saw people being removed from homes en masse. And so then there are immediate consequences for young people who grow up without a parent in the home, another parent in the home. That impacts things like a child's performance in school, that impacts the household because now you have one person trying to make ends meet. And then that also spills out into the neighborhood. When you have a high rate of this, you have fewer people that are earning enough income to afford owning a home. You have more mobility, so you have less stability in the neighborhood. And then over generations, you see 2 and 3 now generations growing up with the same patterns. We interviewed people for the book who are in the 3rd generation of someone in the home being locked up, and so that has devastating and collateral consequences for the families. So when people ask why is violence happening in places like Austin, we point to this generational reproduction of parental absence, and it's cascaded over time.
And I'm kind of curious too, Dan. It's not necessarily always violent criminals and that kind of thing. A lot of times these incarcerations are unjust in that minorities are being jailed for something that perhaps a white person might not be, and therefore the record goes, and then the ball continues to roll down the hill.
That's exactly right. The studies are clear about disproportionality in terms of sentencing for things like drug possession or minor drug sales. Some data that were released for Chicago just about from 2005 to 2009 showed a huge percentage of people from the West Side who were sent to prison were for drug offenses, something like half to a third in some cases. And, certainly drug use is just as high among white populations or in white neighborhoods. But the difference is we don't have a concentrated presence of police looking out for that sort of thing and arresting people and sending people to prison for the same thing.
Yeah. We're speaking with Dan Cooper, Executive Director of the Center for Equitable Cities at Adler University in Chicago. He's also the co-author with Ryan Lugalia-Holland of The War on Neighborhoods, Policing, Prison, and Punishment in a Divided City. And Dan, like many cities across America, Chicago has seen a development boom. Has there been any trickle across town, if you will, as a result?
No, in fact, there hasn't been, and I think this is like the number one issue for activists and folks concerned about equity in the city is that, we've done a great job of positioning Chicago as a global city in terms of attracting corporations and in terms of attracting development downtown, but this has not trickled across town. And I love that phrase, trickle across, because I think it has great parallels to the idea of trickle-down economics. And it's an approach we've had in Chicago where if you just build a great world-class city downtown, somehow that will spill over to neighborhoods. But I think we've actively done the opposite. Instead of trying to embrace policies that would divert money or at least invest money into neighborhoods, we've sort of, the only investment has been punishment. We've had heavy police presence, heavy money spent on incarcerating people. So if you look at the classic $1 million blocks maps you see on the west side in a neighborhood like Austin, where we focus our work, that amounts to sometimes a commitment of $100 million a year or more over the life of sentences that are given out to locking people up. So there's very little effort to invest money in neighborhoods, and I think that's at the heart of our politics in the city.
And part of what you do in the book is deconstruct some common ways of thinking about crime. The first is to steer us away from thinking in simple terms, that crime can be boiled down to either an individual choice or environmental conditions. So what's wrong with both of those constructions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a very important one, because I think the term criminal is very key, because once we label someone a criminal or a gang member, a gangbanger, or a violent offender, we sort of take away their humanity, and we also take away our responsibility for doing something positive in their lives. We can easily brush off our collective responsibility, and I think that's part of the problem. A lot of the crime happening in neighborhoods like Chicago's West Side or other cities like places in D.C. Are that young people are very disconnected from resources, from positive youth and adult supports, and it takes a lot more to lift up a neighborhood than just removing people. But the logic through and through is that people who offend or commit a crime need to be punished, right? And that, in the book, we trace that logic back to some shifts under, the Nixon administration to really take punitive measures against crime. Instead of a war on poverty, we have a war on crime where the solution is punishment. So we've been doing this for decades, and it's only created more ripple effects and hasn't impacted the environmental conditions at all, or perhaps has even made them worse.
Well, and that is another myth that you debunk, that is far too common, that aggressive policing solves crimes. This thinking persists despite solid evidence to the contrary. So what's the appeal of this kind of solution?
I think it's because we all collectively are attracted to short-term solutions. Politicians get elected on a platform of doing something over a short time period. I'll get tough on crime, and in 2 years we'll see a drop in the violent crime rate, et cetera. Nobody's getting elected saying, this is going to be complicated and we need massive state reinvestment in neighborhoods like this, and over 10 years we're going to start seeing results. It's not quite as simple as a solution as the real answer is. And I think that's the problem. We need people talking about commitment to neighborhoods, commitment to bold solutions that experiment with community organization solutions or massive state investments. So I think part of the problem is the voters at large are so used to hearing that a politician is going to turn something around very quickly. And part of it is our electoral politics. So I think we need to, one of the things we want to accomplish in this book is that all people understand that punishment, and in particular concentrated punishment, is bad for neighborhoods and by extension is bad for entire cities. So we need to embrace long-term thinking and experimentation in new programs and finding things that have a better track record than policing and incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Well, and too often we're seeing politicians elected based on 30-second commercials on television. And obviously, if people took the time to read a book such as The War on Neighborhoods, and which has been well researched, they would perhaps learn something and realize that it's not about what is talked about in the 30-second commercial. We're speaking with Dan Cooper, Executive Director of the Center for Equitable Cities at Adler University in Chicago, co-author with Ryan Lugalia-Holland of The War on Neighborhoods, Policing, Prison, and Punishment in a Divided City. Dan, I think what is hopeful about your book is that there are some ideas you write about that do work. Restorative justice is just one example. Tell us about that and other ideas that you find worthy.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And I think, back to the previous question about really quickly about these 30-second ads, I think there's a lot of money in our politics pushing punitive solutions. There are a lot of lobbies for it. However, if you go to communities that we write about, that we talk about, they know what we talk about to be true, that punishment is not helping things in their neighborhoods. And they've been clamoring for solutions for years. And I think a lot of the creative solutions that will ultimately have a better impact are coming from these communities, restorative justice being one of them. It's a big movement in Chicago, but it's certainly in a lot of other cities, and it's a global movement. It's the idea that we can hold people accountable through other means than removing them from their neighborhood and locking them up. It's working in part and parcel with offenders and those who are victims to kind of come up with alternative forms of holding people accountable. And the idea is that it plugs people into community services, and it's the onus of communities to hold people accountable rather than the state. So I think there's a lot of promise. We have the nation's first restorative justice court that's just getting started on Chicago's southwest side. And the idea is that we're going to divert as many people as possible away from the justice system and into other forms of accountability. And we think this is promising because we know the track record of people being locked up is dismal. That stigma on their life as they come out of the prison system impacts them throughout the rest of their life. And so we need to be doing everything to keep them in community. Restorative justice is starting to show promise, and it's just one element. It isn't a blanket solution to everything, but it's something we find really hopeful.
A strong step in the right direction, for sure. From a broader policy perspective, you call for a no-entry agenda. What does that mean?
So we think about it as a multi-layered approach. We mentioned restorative justice programs. That's one element we think is important. But part of the problem is we have short-term thinking where, whether it's foundations or policymakers who think we can just find the one program that's a one-size-fit that's going to change everything in a short period of time. That's not a reality. So I think our starting point is at the legislative level. We need to look at neighborhoods like Chicago's West Side and say, hey, we've done we've got a poor track record. We've done wrong with these policies. We've invested heavily in incarceration, and those are the places we need to actually divert money from the justice system and spend back in those areas in the form of human and community development. So step one is policies that would reclassify felonies, lock up drastically fewer people, and then the cost savings of that, since it's so expensive to lock people up, should be reinvested in places that have been sort of laid to waste by the justice system. So once there's money freed up, these investments should go into collective impact efforts that are driven by cities and foundations and the community organizations all working together to come up with a plan for how money should be best invested in better public safety. And so, we think that should be in education and job creation and programs like restorative justice and youth development. Much more money in positive systems of support for young people. So I think, having that local coordination is huge, not just a little bit of money invested in one program run by a university or run by one organization. It's going to take a lot of different entities and sectors working together and coordinating all their programs and services to support young people through the life course and to reunite families and to also invest in bricks and mortar, things like affordable housing and job creation.
And that all makes a heck of a lot more sense than just locking somebody away up in a cell, for who knows how long and what do they do when they get out. So kudos to you for the book and for your research, and wishing you the best of luck. Dan Cooper, Executive Director of the Center for Equitable Cities at Adler University in Chicago, co-author with Ryan Lugalia Holland of The War on Neighborhoods, Policing, Prison, and Punishment in a Divided City. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We hope to have you back again soon.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the impact of the GOP tax plan and the payout to American workers that didn't happen. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
For more than a century, the New York Times has unabashedly bragged in a banner slogan that it publishes, quote, all the news that's fit to print. Really? Then why did it publish a June 25th front-page article that was neither news nor fit to print? It was a gut job attacking our revolution, the aggressively progressive grassroots political movement that sprang out of Senator Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential run. The Times scoffed that, quote, fewer than 50% of the more than 80 candidates OR has endorsed have won elections this year. Huh? Newsflash for clueless media cognoscenti. Winning anywhere near half of your campaigns is a stunning achievement. It's all the more stunning that it's being achieved by the feisty progressive rebels of our revolution. For nearly all of the candidates they endorse are unconventional, first-time contenders who start out with no name recognition, no fat cat money, and no support from establishment power brokers. I happen to be a board member of the upstart Our Revolution movement, so I know many of these gutsy mavericks personally, and I've seen their surprisingly successful campaigns from the ground level. They're winning because they're bringing political integrity and Bernie's big policy ideas to voters hungry for both, and because in less than 2 years, OR has organized hundreds of thousands of Democratic populists into more than 600 active political networks all across the country, including grassroots organizing in red areas the party has long ignored. This is Jim Hightower saying, asked about the Times mocking of the movement's win-loss record, Senator Sanders deadpanned, "It's not a baseball game." In fact, though, even the biggest of baseball superstars have never come close to a .500 batting average, nor will the Times ever hit 500 on its pledge to cover all the news fit to print.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Leo Gerard is president of North America's largest industrial union. He says the plan to cut Americans' taxes has been a windfall for corporate executives at the expense of American workers. And we say hello to Leo Gerard. He's president of the United Steelworkers International Union, where he fights to preserve and create union wage jobs that support middle-class families and their communities. Leo Gerard, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Good to be on with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You know, you recently wrote an op-ed, and it was titled, "Where's That $4,000 Raise the GOP Promised Workers?" in which you question the payoff promised by the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the wake of the Republican tax bill. One of the issues that you raise is about wage increases. What was the promise, and what do we know so far about what has really happened?
Well, first of all, the promise was that this would be good for workers and that they would receive, on average, $4 an hour increase over as a result of this increase in opportunity for them as a result of the tax cut, which was really a bunch of, as Joe Biden would say, malarkey. The fact of the matter is it did the exact opposite. A few workers were given a raise, or a bonus. I shouldn't call it a raise. That's misspeaking. I mean, they were given a one-time bonus, and they got some PR out of it. A lot of the companies that gave the so-called bonus were already low-wage employers. But what really happened is there was a windfall for the corporate elite in having stock buybacks and feeding themselves at the trough. Most of the corporate elites got a windfall.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in looking at where corporate money is actually going, you mentioned stock buybacks, so we have to talk about that. These were actually illegal for much of the 20th century until 1982. How do they work, and what's their impact on the economy?
Well, it's a fairly simple but yet devious process. Usually the CEO will get the board to agree that they should buy back a bunch of their stock, and as a result of that, they drive up the price of the stock, and they put the stock to use in primarily raising the income of the executive team at the company, who are often paid in large chunks of stock. And what it really does is it deviates the income that could be used to raise wages that could be used to pay down pension debt, that could be used to invest in the company's R&D, but it's not. It's used to funnel corporate CEOs and their top teams an economic windfall. And yes, it should be illegal. It was illegal, I think, if my memory's right, till 1980 or 82, something like that, in the 1980s. And the reason it's illegal is it's really a form of feeding at the trough. You know that if you buy so much stock back in a one-time or two-time buy, that the value of that stock's going to go up. And they try to say, well, that's good for everybody, because if you've got your money in a 401k or another kind of investment vehicle, you'll benefit. The fact of the matter is that the average American doesn't have $5,000 in their 401k or $5,000 invested, whereas lots of CEOs and their leadership and the financial people have tens of billions of dollars invested, and they get the majority of the windfall.
What do we know so far about corporate use of stock buybacks since the tax bill was enacted?
Well, what we know is there's been very little investment in raising workers' wages. There's been very little investment in paying down debt. There's been very little investment in modernizing facilities. There's been very little investment in talking about taking money and modernizing the firm. What's become obvious is that the majority of the money has been used to give the corporate leadership of America a huge windfall. And then we've seen people like Sheldon Adelson send them a thank you note of $30 million. The so-called dark money is going to look at, quote, a return on their investment, and they're going to pour more and more money into the political system. And as if it's not enough, the Trump administration is already talking about a second tax giveaway. And we already know that this is going to add billions of dollars to the deficit. And when they do that, they'll want to say, well, look, we can't afford this and we can't afford that. And they'll start putting more pressure on earned benefits like Medicare and Medicaid, earned benefits like Social Security. And they'll want to do cutbacks, so they'll say they can't afford it. But they could have afforded it if they wouldn't have given all the money to the corporate leadership.
We're speaking with Leo Gerard, president of the United Steelworkers International Union, where he fights to preserve and create union wage jobs that support middle-class families and their communities here on America's Democrats podcast. Is there a legislative fix for this problem, Leo? I mean, is it possible that stock buybacks could once again become illegal?
I think there's no sort of technical reason why it couldn't. There is a political reason why it hasn't. And the political reason is that certainly the corporate influence and the dark money influence on the Republican Party, on the current president, is such that they have no interest in doing anything that's going to help working people. They're prepared to talk, at least this administration is prepared to talk a good game, but nothing positive has occurred. And so as a legal matter, is it possible? Absolutely. As a political matter, is it possible? Not unless we could get a Democratic majority and a Democratic president and have a groundswell of rank and file activism to make the process illegal again like it was back before it changed in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Now, stock buybacks aren't the only issue that you write about. You also predict that workers will be paying more for cars, homes, and credit card debt. Why is that the case?
Well, because there's going to be an increase in the Federal Reserve interest rate. That will push everything up. That means that, again, the same concerns that I had earlier, that benefit of that tax cut is going to go overwhelmingly to the people that need it the least. And it's going to, again, with stock buybacks and whatnot, they're going to lose the impetus to invest in their own corporations. But maybe much more important than that is that they know it's going to drive up the deficit, and they know that that's going to drive up interest rates, and they know that that's going to be paid for by workers who are already getting strangled economically.
Yeah, and there are even some predictions that the tax plan will add as much as $3 trillion to the national debt. And yet Republicans, as you brought up a few minutes ago, say they're not done with tax cuts yet. Can we expect to see more changes that favor the rich over workers, or is there any possible way that trickle-down economics might actually work?
Look, I actually think that we're in a race to get common sense back in government. And I think we have to work really hard between now and the midterm elections to take back the House, hopefully take back the Senate, which is a heavier lift, and at that point rescind the whole economic model that's been put in place, and try to get sound economic decisions. And you got to give President Obama credit that he took the economy out of the ditch that was put there. As he said, they got the economy out of the ditch. We shouldn't reelect the people that put it in the ditch. Well, we saw as the result of that what has happened now. And we need to take back the House and Senate. And if we do that, we can reverse the tax policy. And look, workers need a tax break. But they also need good jobs that pay decent wages so they can pay taxes. And when the administration is continuously talking lately about the unemployment level, you got to look at what kind of jobs those are being created. And they're not the high-wage jobs. Those high-wage jobs are being sent to China and South Korea and India and Indonesia, as we have unfair trade deficits. So that if we want to talk about really fixing deficits, we ought to talk about fixing the trade deficit, and we ought to talk about fixing the economic deficit for workers and retirees.
Now, as we approach the midterm elections, what should voters be asking of their candidates? Are there realistic policy ideas that could reverse these trends?
Well, sure. I think that we got to look at why are we drifting or racing into all the level of inequality. That's because they've been a continuous attack over the last 40 years on trade unions and the right to bargain. We have the lowest level of unionization in the advanced OECD countries, and we've weakened workers' bargaining power with the dark money that comes into the electoral process. We weaken the voice of workers. When the Supreme Court says that they can't limit financial contributions to campaigns because that would limit free speech, what you're basically saying is the more money you have, the louder your voice, the less money you have, the less voice you have. And when you look at that relative to the political decision-making and the policy decision-making that goes on, they're not policy decisions that would make life better for the average working person. So I say, yeah, there's things that can be done. There's policies that can be put in place. There's a longer-term campaign that needs to be done so that workers have a right to collectively bargain and to unionize. We have to look at things like equal pay for equal work. I mean, there's all kinds of things, and they're not going to get done unless we elect people that are going to understand that that's a good way to take the economy. And one of the things that would help a lot is if we were to really make the investments in infrastructure that are falling apart. And again, go back to the tax cut and the stock buybacks limited a lot of ability. You haven't heard them talking. You haven't heard Republicans talking about rebuilding the infrastructure very much since they got their tax cut, and since there's been a discussion for a second tax cut.
Well, Leo Gerard, president of the United Steelworkers International Union, joining us today on America's Democrats podcast. Leo, thank you very much for your time. Folks, get out and vote. It's the only way we're going to change just all the damage that's been done in the short time of this administration. Leo, thank you again for your time and for joining us today on America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be on, and really the thing is, we got to take back our country this time from those that are putting it to ruin.
Yes, sir. All right. Thanks again, Leo. This is America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Mike Lux, author of How to Democrat in the Age of Trump.
Where we welcome to the studio a good friend, a longtime Democratic strategist and activist, a president of a great group called American Family Voices, Mike Lux, who is out with a new book, I love it, called How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. You've turned Democrat into a verb. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Democrats need to be in action, so I figured we should turn Democrat into a verb.
No, it's a great message. Democrats particularly need to be in action, Absolutely. Even more so after last week. Mike, we've been at it for just a little bit this morning, and we always like to give our listeners and viewers a chance to comment.
Well, our Twitter folks are very on topic for Mike. Paulo says, because we were talking about the Supreme Court pick and what Democrats could do to try and stop it, Paulo Lim says red state Democrats should shrug off the pressure to vote for a Supreme Court pick and instead just listen to Democratic-leaning voters. Republicans were going to be energized to vote on SCOTUS issues anyway, vacancy or not. Walker Ogden says what the spineless Democrats means is let's wait and see how much our donors will pay us. And we were talking about Donald Trump's attacks on the press on Friday because there were his constant attacks on the press. We actually saw it turn into violence over the weekend. Tim Abel says hate begets more hate. Violence begets more violence. That is the lesson from Donald Trump. If you have a comment, find us on Twitter at BP Show, at BP Show. We'll read your comments there.
As former President Bill Clinton used to say, words matter.
Words do matter, for sure. And Trump's hateful words really have changed the nation in a terrible way. And we're seeing that play out all over the country.
So, in a word, how do Democrats Democrat in the age of Trump?
Well, first of all, they just need... I'm sorry, were you...
No, go ahead. Yeah.
They just need to have the courage to say what they believe. I mean, I think that Democrats get into their biggest problems when they hem and haw and when people don't believe that they really mean what they say. And I think there's a message out there that will appeal to both our base voters and to swing voters in those red states. I'm from Nebraska. That's a red state. My wife's from Missouri. That's a red state. But I tell you something. When I was out on my book tour, going to places, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, other places that are red states, people are really responding to the message, and the message is Trump is trying to divide us. He's trying to bring up all of these racial resentments in order to pick our pocket. And what we need to do is we need to talk about how to build an economy and a country that works for everybody, that works for working people of all races, of all regions. And when you talk in those terms, people really respond.
Well, you know, what I hear from a lot of people is that Democrats have a great shot this year in taking back the House, and more an uphill fight, but still possible.
Still possible in the Senate.
Of getting the Senate. I feel good about that. But what I hear from people is, but the problem is Democrats don't have a message. The only message they have is anti-Trump. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, do you think that's true? And What's wrong with being anti-Trump?
Well, there's nothing wrong with being anti-Trump because he's the nastiest guy we've ever elected. But I think we do have to be more than that. And the ironic thing, Bill, is that, as I talk to candidates around the country, as I listen to television ads, radio ads, candidates are really talking about issues. They are really talking about things that matter to local folks.
Bingo.
And the national media are the ones that are obsessed with Trump and that don't want to talk about anything other than Trump.
If you look at Beto O'Rourke, for example, in Texas,
absolutely.
I mean, he's talking about the issues that matter to the people of Texas. Right?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
John Tester is talking about the things that matter to the people of Montana.
They really are. You look at the Virginia races last year where everybody was talking about, we won all these races. We didn't win on an anti-Trump message. People were talking about local transportation issues. They were talking about local jobs issues. They were talking about things that were happening in Virginia. And when I was out in the Midwest, same deal. People were talking about those issues. When Crowley got upset, she won because she was talking about local issues that mattered to local folks. Now, some of those were national, like Medicare for all.
Yeah.
But she was talking about real issues that mattered to real people. She wasn't talking in broad ideological terms. She wasn't railing against Trump. She was talking about how do we solve the problems that people have right now.
Right. So I agree. Democrats do have a strong message this year. Basically, I think we're going to deliver the stuff that Donald Trump said he was going to deliver, never did. I mean, in a sense, right? He claimed to be a populist, and he's nothing but an elitist.
Exactly. Donald Trump said he was for working people. Turns out he's for working billionaires, or maybe retired billionaires, but he's for billionaires. That's what he's for, and we have to be for the people. I mean, I argue in my book that Democrats kind of lost their way a while back. We kind of got confused about who we were and what we were for, and that if we go back to being the party of people, the party of working folks, that's what's going to win us elections going forward.
So what do you think is you referred to it, but the message that comes out of the defeat of Joe Crowley, who was Mr. Queens, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost what was happening in Queens was almost back to the Tammany Hall days, right? It was real machine politics, and he was the boss of Queens, right? And a good guy. I like Joe.
Yeah,
and everybody assumed he would be the next Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he certainly was making moves. but he was knocked off by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 28 years old. Bernie Sanders. Her only political activity was being an organizer for Bernie Sanders the last time around, right?
Right. Yeah.
But the district had changed. And you said she was speaking. So what's the message is there a message there for national Democrats?
Well, I think the message is we need to be in better touch with, national Democrats need to be in better touch with our base, with our grassroots. And that's one thing I talk about in my book. And I've watched this happen. I was in the Clinton White House. Mm-hmm. I was in the Obama transition.
We got to know each other.
That's where we got to know each other. And I've seen this happen over the years, that national Democrats have gotten kind of isolated from our base, from our grassroots folks. We've stopped talking to them. We've stopped listening to them. And instead, we try to make decisions from the top down. I think we cannot be a top-down party and win. We have to work with our grassroots, listen to them, be part of them. If we're going to win elections, we can't. If you burn down the bridge between the grassroots and the national leaders, we're going to keep losing elections.
I don't want to reopen the whole of the 2016 presidential primary, but listening to you, that was a criticism that Bernie Sanders had of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So looking back, do you think that Bernie's presence in the primary was a net plus or a net minus?
Oh, I think it was a net plus because he expressed what millions of people felt deep down in their heart. I think if he hadn't run, if Hillary had just gone on to win the nomination without any opposition or any serious opposition, I think she would have been, a worse candidate. And I think all of those people would have felt even less represented and would have turned out less. So I think she would have lost more than that she did had Bernie not run. And I also think for the future of the party, that message needs to be represented. It needs to be part of our debate and our dialogue. And I talk in the book about how our arrogance, National Democrats' arrogance, is what fueled the Bernie thing. It would not have happened if it wasn't for some of the decisions that had been made by National Democrats.
Mike Lux, our guest, he keeps mentioning the book, and the book is How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. And, of course, I've seen it in the bookstores, and it's available in your local bookstore or wherever you purchase books, even online, of course, at Amazon or at Barnes & Noble. One of the things that I find so exciting these days, Mike, and you and I have been at this for a long time, is, and I think we certainly saw this in I forget the number of the district in New York with Joe Crowley, but with the victory of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is the energy from the grassroots.
Oh yeah,
nationwide. You mentioned we saw
Absolutely.
it in Virginia, we saw it up in the Queens, we've seen it all across the country. That's one thing that Donald Trump has brought about, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I haven't seen this kind of energy since the Vietnam War protests in the late 60s.
No, it's been incredible. I've been in politics for 40 years. I kind of missed the Vietnam.
Yeah.
I was too young, but certainly since I've been in politics, this is more energy, and we're seeing, candidates coming out of the woodwork, running for all kinds of offices. It's really exciting. I'll give you an example. In Iowa, which is a state that I've done a lot of politics in, the first in the nation caucuses, historically a swing state, but Trump won it big in 2016. But in Iowa, 30 different candidates ran for statewide constitutional office or congressional office this year in the primaries. 27 of the 30 were brand new candidates, had never held elective office. Were not running as, like state senator trying to move up. They were just people from the grassroots running for office. That, to me, is the best sign possible. People are fired up. They're wanting to run for office. They're wanting to get involved, and they're wanting to stay active. People are not backing down. And I think that is going to help us a huge amount in 2018 and 2020. And what National Democrats need to do is to not stifle that energy, not push back and say, oh, we can't have all these grassroots folks.
So. Coming from California, of course, I was, everybody was very, very, very alarmed and worried that there were so many candidates, they were tripping over each other, and we might get locked out because of that jungle primary in California. And I kept saying to people, listen, just relax. It's okay. This is good. Yeah, it may be a little messy, but this is the good side is the sign that so many people want to run and so many people are inspired to run and are out there, and they're candidates that really do represent those districts like she did in the Queens. And it turned out all right.
It turned out all right. Yeah, right. The jungle primary is a funky thing, and so that's
I'm not defending the jungle primary.
Exactly, and that did create that sense of danger. But the fact is, there was so much energy on the Democratic side, and we got so many more voters out. That we just overwhelmed that possibility, and it all turned out for the good. And we got some great candidates. There's some terrific candidates running in California.
So is the National Party leadership, such as it is, the DNC or whatever, or the executive committee of the DNC, have they gotten the message? Are they responding?
I think they're getting the message. I think all of this, everybody wants. And
it takes a while to turn a battleship around,
It does. And I talk in my book. I have a specific message toward Bernie voters and toward local activists, which is that the future is yours, but you need to understand that politics is messy and it takes time, and nothing changes overnight. And I think what I see happening at the National Democratic Party is that they are starting to get the message. They are starting to starting to make changes, starting to figure things out. I'm seeing some really good things happening, but I'm also still seeing some bad things happening. There's no question. The DCCC has gotten involved in some primaries that they shouldn't have gotten involved in my view.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by being top-down.
And that's, again, the establishment top-down thing that we know better in Washington. Who could represent a district in whatever, Kansas or Nebraska.
And it's a complaint that you hear at the local level, not just, by the way, from progressives or Bernie people, but I was talking to some very mainstream Democrats in the Midwest, and they were telling stories about how, oh, yeah, we had this great candidate that we were all excited about, and the National Party swooped in and said somebody else has to be the candidate, and there was no enthusiasm, and they, that kind of story keeps getting repeated. But the fact that the National Party is losing some of these primaries, not just Crowley, but in places like Omaha and Kentucky, where the hand-picked establishment candidate lost.
Yeah, right.
That to me is a sign that the grassroots is flexing their muscles and saying, you know what, we're going to go our own way, and I think that's a very healthy thing. It may not make for the perfect candidate every time, but it's a very healthy trend overall.
I must admit, I was on vacation last week, so I missed the big vote on superdelegates. But there was an important vote last week by the DNC Executive Committee, I guess, on reducing the power of superdelegates.
Yeah, they again sort of it's a multi-step process. It's not done.
Right.
These things just take time. But yeah, they're moving in the right direction. That's the important thing. They're moving in the right direction, and I think the next convention, superdelegates will have less of a role, and there will be less superdelegates. I hope. We'll see what happens, but they're moving in the right direction.
So the president was asked yesterday about. He was on Fox News Sunday with Maria Bartiromo, a previously taped interview, but played yesterday morning. And he brought up the subject of ICE and what to do about ICE. He sees Democrats making a big mistake on this. Here he is.
That's going to be their platform. Open borders, which equals crime. I think they'll never win another election, so I'm actually quite happy about it.
They'll never win another election if they get rid of ICE. I guess, is this an issue that Democrats should run away from? And by the way, Amy Klobuchar yesterday came out and said, no, we have to keep ICE. Kirsten Gillibrand came out over the weekend and said, no, it's, we keep the Border Patrol, but let's get rid of ICE and then start from scratch and build a better organization. Is this a hot button issue, or?
First of all, I think there's no way the Democrats can run from this issue or ignore this issue. This is where I talk in the book about just having the courage to speak to people about where we're at and why we believe what we believe. We are not going to win elections by turning off the base and ignoring their issues. That was part of what happened in the 2010 cycle that was so devastating. We didn't act on immigration. We didn't act on criminal justice reform. We didn't act on a whole series of issues that would have gotten out our voters and fired people up. What we need to do is be honest with folks about what's going on. So I happen to agree with the folks, Elizabeth Warren, you mentioned Gillibrand, who say we need to completely restructure ICE. That doesn't mean we're going to have completely open borders.
Exactly.
Let's not let Trump, turn this into something ridiculous, which he always loves to do. What we're saying is ICE, as it's structured today, has become the wrong kind of agency. The culture of the agency is one that lends itself toward cruelty. And we can't be a country that allows that. What we need to do is we need to restructure ICE. We need to we need to end it, break it apart, and restructure it, and have a system that is more humane, that makes more sense, but that still does reasonable protection of the border. So, and we can do that. It's not like we've never done that before. I mean, this is a great country. We've done this in the past, right? And we can do it again. Obama did a much better job in terms of border protection, and
so did George W. Bush.
So did George W. Bush. So did Bill Clinton. So did the first George Bush. So did Ronald Reagan. They all did a better job on this issue than Trump has.
Right.
And we can't let Trump scare us by creating this boogeyman. If there is no ICE, there is no border protection, which is just absurd.
Right. He says, if you're not totally for ICE, then you're for open borders. Yesterday, he even tweeted out, if there's no ICE, people will be afraid to leave their homes. I mean, talk about the
and again, it's that hardcore racist thing where he's equating immigration with crime. You can't get any more racist than that, Bill. I mean, that is like right down the line.
Absolutely.
It's like the welfare queen of Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
Where they implied that all these black folks were like sucking off the system off of welfare. That kind of talk is pure racism, and we need to push back about it. And we need to remind people throughout our history, folks like Trump have used racism so that they can distract people and pick their pocket.
All right. How to Democrat in the Age of Trump is the name of the book again. Mike Lux. How do Democrats Democrat to stop Donald Trump from getting or do you think there's any shot at Democrats blocking Donald Trump from getting another seat in the Supreme Court?
I of course I think there's a shot. I mean, there's always a shot. Elizabeth Warren has a great saying, which is that you don't win every fight you have, but if you don't fight, you can't win. And we won on health care. We've won on some other big issues since Trump's been there. And I think what we have to do is we have to make this about women's freedom. Are women going to have the freedom to not? And it's not just about abortion. This is about their whole health care system. This is about health care in general. I mean, is the Supreme Court going to rule that insurance companies can do whatever they want in terms of pre-existing conditions? This is about, and I talk in the book about this, this is about what kind of freedom America is going to have. Is it the freedom of Donald Trump, which is the freedom of rich people to do whatever they want to whoever they want to do it to, or is it the freedom of all of us to make the decisions we want to make about our own lives, about raising our families, about building a better future for ourselves? Does government give us the tools to do that, and therefore the freedom to do that? So I think if we make this fight about freedom, that's something that's going to be very applicable to people like Collins in Maine, like Murkowski in Alaska, and I think we can win this fight.
Can a Joe Manchin or a Joe Donnelly or a Claire McCaskill get reelected in their red states without voting?
Oh, of course they can.
For Donald Trump.
They voted. All of those folks voted with us on the health care issue because we framed the debate in the right way. All of them voted with us on the tax issue because we framed the debate in the right way. If we define this nominee the way Teddy Kennedy defined Robert Bork, we can win this fight, and we can unite Democrats and also win over some Republicans. There's no question about it.
All right. It's a strong message, and it is an important message, and it's a very timely message, all wrapped up in the book, How to Democrat in the Age of Trump. Mike Lux, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
You can follow Mike, by the way, at American Family Voices. That's his. He's president of the organization, AmericanFamilyVoices.org. Check that out.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Dan Cooper, Leo Gerard, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.